Well, welcome everyone. My name is Rony Kubat. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Tulip. I'm joined here by Eduardo from Rise. I guess let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Eduardo Torrealba. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Meter, and we're the company that built the Rise Emergency Ventilator.
Awesome. Well, so thanks again for joining us. I'm excited to hear about this project because it's for those who aren't familiar with it. It's a pretty amazing story of making something a complete zero to full product in 3 weeks, which is pretty intense. So yeah, so let's get started.
Yeah, Meter is a industrial inspection hardware startup. It's based here in Somerville, Massachusetts. We haven't really publicly talked about what we're doing in detail yet, but we ended up jumping into the efforts to work on COVID-19 projects pretty quickly whenever shelter in place happened, and so we ended up building this ventilator. But it's very different from our core business, and so it was kind of a one-off effort by the team.
So you had sort of this like crack team of engineers and just repurposed them on a dime to start making something completely different.
Yeah, exactly. We got pretty lucky with the team that we had for this one moment. So, we were able to have kind of all the pieces that were needed to build this system at the request of some clinical partners that one of our engineers had previously worked with at Mass General Hospital.
So how did it come about? So the world closed down, and then what happened?
Yeah, so our team was, cranking along on our industrial inspection work, and then we got the shelter in place order, and we all went home and started working remotely. And then one of our engineers, when he was doing his PhD at MIT in mechanical engineering, had previously worked with some doctors at Mass General on some respirator technologies for like emerging economies. And those same doctors reached out to him and said, we've got this pretty intense ventilator shortage that we think could happen here in Boston, and the other open source projects that are going on aren't really at the level that we need them to be in order to put them on patients, and we don't know if we'll be able to get enough traditional ventilators to fill the gap there. And they'd asked him, if there's anything he could do to help, and so he approached me and said, is this something I could go do on nights and weekends? And, maybe it would take 50% of my time or something for the next few weeks. And we talked about it more, and we decided that, this is probably the best thing that our company could do for our community. And so we actually ended up just pivoting the entire company for a very short period of time and exclusively working on this product.
So can you describe a little bit like what kind of a ventilator it is? Because I know there's a big broad spectrum of ventilators out there.
Yeah, exactly. So this is, the classification that most people are using is an emergency ventilator. We built a system that takes one of these sort of standard bags that you can buy for a lot of emergency situations, and our system squeezes that bag, and that pressure that comes out of squeezing the bag is then used to drive air into a patient's lungs. And the key with what we're doing here is that we have a very complete set of both sensing and controls built into this ventilator, so that it's able to function more similarly to a traditional ventilator that has its own special flow systems inside of it, whether that's creating its own pressure or using the air coming in from the main system inside of a hospital or another medical facility.
So I mean I'm familiar with these kind of bags because you see them on like every doctor show ever.
Right.
But what makes it hard, right? What makes this like a hard problem to try to solve?
Yeah, the challenge is much more in the logistics, manufacturing, supply chain, and time crunch side of things than it is on the, what maybe we would consider raw engineering side. So, if you were paying attention and on social media, like everybody was, I think at the time, you probably saw dozens of people who said, we built an improvised ventilator that can squeeze, one of these bags. And so squeezing a bag is ultimately not that hard to do. Squeezing the bag correctly is more challenging, and that's where, the relationships we had with world-class clinicians came in handy. They could give us a lot of feedback on what that system needed to look like. But we also had, as I said, a PhD level researcher with deep and extensive experience in the field that was able to say, these are what the parameters need to be. This is what the feedback control loop needs to look like. This is what all of the different, feedback loops need to be designed to do. And so he was able to architect the entire system and help, and the rest of us were able to help implement that thing.
So how long did it take to go through that, that initial design phase? And then like, how were you thinking about manufacturing at the time when you were doing the design work?
Yeah, we did everything in parallel. So we ended up, we worked closely with another company here in Boston, Desktop Metal. They provided space for us to work out of, which was greatly appreciated. The office space that we're typically working out of is in a large shared facility, and for a lot of reasons, we didn't want to be going into something like that during kind of the early days of COVID. So Desktop Metal was able to provide us with kind of a dedicated spot inside their facility that already closed down for us to work out of. So we stood that up. We had the first conversation about doing this on a Sunday evening as a team. And by Tuesday, we were setting up a facility to start working out of with the intent to manufacture there. And so we were designing in parallel. We ended up doing, I think it was ultimately 6 revisions of the design in 21 days. And so and those are like full builds with sheet metal, sometimes with 3D printed parts, multiple real revs of a product in 21 days. And so there really was no, it never stopped, right? We were doing design reviews at 1 o'clock in the morning on random evenings when we needed to, so that we could start a 3D print or a laser cut job or a sheet metal job the next morning.
So was this like, would you say that this is like in some sense like a normal manufacturing design life cycle, or was it just compressed, or was there something outside of the ordinary, above and beyond?
Yeah, I think that the two things that made it very different from a normal product design sprint would be the speed, like you talked about, but I think the more interesting one, for applications in the future would actually be the supply chain problems. So there are a lot of components. If you're designing, what I would call a real or traditional ventilator, you lean on certain supply chains and certain components that are really well made for these kinds of problems. One example would be pressure transducers or oxygen flow sensors. There are medical versions of these things that are out there on the market. You can buy them, in pretty decent quantities. You would design your electronics around that interface there. But those items were either not available at all, or they needed to be used in the ramp up of traditional ventilators with the understanding that we had of, the situation. So we didn't want to be going out there and trying to source, a sensor or really any component that Medtronic or someone like GM or Ford that was building their own, ramping up a ventilator effort was also trying to source. We didn't want to get into a bidding war for components. And so we designed everything around components that you could find in more traditional machine tools or in white goods or any of these other categories where there's massive supply of these items, but they might have different, life cycle intent traditionally than what you put in a medical device. And so those limitations changed the way that we thought about the product, and we ended up building things like what we call the hardware abstraction layer, so that it would be possible to put an arbitrary stepper motor or an arbitrary sensor onto the PCBA that we designed. So if supply chains were ebbing and flowing, if the device ended up going into production, we would be able to have a dozen of one sensor and a dozen of another sensor and still be able to make all that work.
So, you're as a, really an early startup, and having a lot of experience in that sort of the world of advanced technology as it comes to making things. How have you used sort of new technologies in the design development of this device?
Yeah, we really leaned heavily on a lot of these technologies that I think have really come into their own in the last 5 to 10 years. 3D printing was a big one for us. We ended up using it for a lot of our early prototypes, but then we had a couple of parts that we designed for injection molding, but also designed to be 3D printable simultaneously. And we ended up sourcing, hundreds of those components from a 3D printing service bureau called Fathom. That was quite helpful for us. We also worked extensively in cloud-based CAD tools like Onshape. We used that quite a bit. We did all of our mechanical design in Onshape. And that made it possible to do those distributed design reviews that I was talking about. Because you have to remember, we're doing all of this basically from our apartments and our homes. There were a couple of people that would go into that, workspace at the beginning, but we tried to keep that as minimal as possible to respect social distancing guidelines. And then, we worked with a lot of quick turn prototyping and production shops. So there's a group called Circuit Hub that was able to make all of our PCBAs very quickly in a way that, wouldn't have been the way that you would make PCBAs 10 years ago. They were able to turn that around much faster in smaller quantities than what you would have gotten before then. And then, a lot of the cloud collaboration tools that I think every company is using. So Slack and Zoom, just like this conversation that we're having right now, a lot of those tools enabled us to pretty seamlessly keep everything up to date and stay in sync as a team.
Was the sort of accelerated timeline across things have an influence on the way you did things or the process behind them?
Certainly. I think, two of the examples I have, one of them is the work that we did with Tulip. I'll get to that in a second. But the other one would be the way that we use 3D printing. I worked at a 3D printing company. I'm a big proponent of 3D printing, but I also am very well aware of the limitations that it has. And almost universally, if someone is designing something and I'm working with an engineer and they want to 3D print it, I try to have a long conversation with them about what are the other ways that we could make that object to avoid 3D printing, because it does have a lot of challenges associated with it. If there's something you can buy off of a shelf, it's probably going to be much better than the 3D printed version. But when, the supply chain is as disrupted as it was due to COVID, there were parts that we were ordering from McMaster, and then we knew that they weren't going to arrive for 2 or 3 or 4 days. And when we're doing 6 revs in 21 days, that's too long. That we would metal 3D print on a desktop metal 3D printer, using design files that would come from a manufacturer. So we were printing standard parts that I would normally just buy and say, oh, this shipping got delayed, let's wait another day. But we didn't have any time for that. And so we were printing standard parts or machining them at Proto Labs or other places. So, this is a very different way to approach creating hardware than what I would typically do.
What I guess, did you take, what did you learn from that you'll take away with you to the future work?
I think that was more of a confirmation of a suspicion that I've had for a long time, that 3D printing is good enough to replace a lot of the standard supply chain. It's certainly expensive and time consuming from an individual operator standpoint, but it's, the parts that we were 3D printing, whether those were polymer parts on HP printers or the metal parts on desktop metal systems, those were one-to-one drop-ins for something that would have been a cast and post-machine part or an injection molded part. And that was incredibly powerful and allowed us to move much faster than we would have been able to without those tools.
So I'm curious on this accelerated revision count in such a compressed three weeks time frame. What was the feedback loop like between these revisions?
Yeah, our typical process, during that 3-week period would involve, we would finish a design, we'd lock that in, we would produce everything we needed in order to, mechanically prototype that part. We would have one of our engineers would put that together. They would drive it over to another engineer's house. That engineer had a full lab set up in their basement from their work previously with MGH, and they would instrument everything and start testing it. And we would typically hop on a Zoom call with some clinicians from Mass General Hospital who would give us direct feedback on, the things they were seeing on a Zoom call like this. So he would point his webcam at it and they would ask different questions and he'd show data. And it was just like being in a lab with someone, but over a video call instead. And then we'd go through that process. And while that was happening, maybe that's a 36-hour turn, we're in the background, constantly redesigning from things we saw during a assembly process or manufacturing process, or just stuff that we know needs to be improved based on our own engineering experience.
So to switch gears a bit to, having gone through these iterations and transitioning into the actual manufacturing side of things. So, so when you think about like on whether it be the assembly or testing process about this, like, I mean, you were using Tulip here for it. Like, what were you using it for, and like, now it's been a little bit of time working with it. What was it like?
Yeah, our, um, when we ended up getting an emergency order for some units, one of the first phone calls I made that morning was to Natan at Tulip to say, hey, we have to make these, and not just have to make a few hundred of them, but there's a chance that we might have to make several thousand of these within the next few weeks. And I know from a lot of experience building hardware that you can lose months in a typical project with just the typical CM bring up process, right? Getting a contract manufacturer to have all the stations and the work instructions and everything else in place is a real challenge. That's not an easy thing to pull off. And doing it in a compressed timeline is kind of crazy to think about. But since we were going to do the manufacturing ourselves, I knew that we could take the tools that Tulip had and 100% document every single step that we were taking in this very quick turn, small batch manufacturing environment, and use that to think about not just getting through that log of orders, but being prepped for thousands of units, right? So we ended up spending a little bit more time in order to thoroughly document that process using Tulip software, so that if there had been a situation where we had to pivot to working with other CMs, we could basically get them to install a Tulip instance and be up and running with work instructions and documentation and everything that they would need, to start cranking out parts much faster than if we were having to conform to a system.
As part of sort of the delivery package to the CM.
That's right, exactly. Yeah. So instead of just delivering, drawings and CAD files and firmware, we'd be delivering all of the tooling, all of the jigs and fixtures, all the work instructions, video, photos of all of this being done once before.
So this is all happening sort of contemporaneously with the design build iterations as well?
That's right. Yeah, we would lock in a few, I hesitate to say subsystems. It wasn't that complex of a device, but we would lock in certain sections, and then we would start documenting those. And as we receive parts from our suppliers and we were able to build them, we would do like pretty thorough documentation of that subassembly and making sure that it was, properly documented so that it could turn into time estimates and work instructions and everything else to scale to tens of thousands of units. Thankfully, that didn't end up being the case, but we wanted to be prepared for it if it had been.
So what do you think are like what are the things that you couldn't do otherwise?
Couldn't do otherwise meaning without what?
Well, I mean, like, alternatively, you're doing this documentation in like Word files and
yeah, right. I think it would have been, a bunch of photos and some notes and PowerPoints and Word and that sort of thing. And, in a true emergency situation, that probably would have sufficed. But knowing that the thing we were documenting this in could be the actual thing that someone else would use to make the device is incredibly powerful. And I've worked with enough CMs and enough, CM bring up processes to know that they can have these like very gnarly systems that are really difficult to interface with that I would never want to use alongside a first prototype run. But Tulip was so easy to use that we were able to get it up and running, while we're sprinting at full speed on designing and testing, iterating. We were able to do all of that and work and think about manufacturing, and that just wouldn't have been possible with any other tools that I've been exposed to.
So what's going to happen next? What's next for Rise?
Yeah, thankfully we didn't end up needing, the units that we were building for Massachusetts. They were able to flatten the curve very effectively due to some really amazing work by our government officials, as well as the medical community here. And I think just the general population doing a really good job locking things down. And the need for ventilators wasn't as intense as what we were originally projecting at the end of March when we started this. And so now, today, if you look at the sort of national picture, the United States is actually net exporting ventilators to other countries in the world, and so there's really not a need for these devices right now, which is fantastic news. Um, Most other countries, I think, are doing a fairly effective job fighting COVID. Obviously, that's not true everywhere, but by and large, it's not as bad as I think a lot of us feared it could have been initially. In terms of the need for ventilators, obviously the human toll has been gigantic. But we ended up getting to the point where we had this documentation and the design and everything else, and we put together a web page. You can go to riseventilator.com and check that out. And on that webpage, we say that we're looking for people who would want to be operational partners. And our stance is, this is not our core business. We are not a medical devices company. We don't want to become a medical devices company. We want to continue working on the thing that we were doing before all this started. And so we basically wound down our efforts on Rise, and we're open to working with people who might see a need for this device. Maybe there's someone in another country or someone in another context that might want to be able to deploy something like this, in which case we would be able to hand off all the things that we would have handed off to a contract manufacturer: design files, documentation, the Tulip documentation, all those sorts of things, to allow someone else to begin producing these devices and supporting their use in the field, if that's something that's needed. I hope that this is a device that's never needed, but if it is, then it's good to know that it's there and it's ready to go if it's ever called for.
It's kind of like it's like the best of problems, right? If this the kind of life-saving technology is the need dries up for it, is like right. That's great news in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate the time to chat today. Best of luck both with the Rise ventilator as well as forthcoming new products.
Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate it. I'm glad we could work with you guys on this one.